a serious crisis. Professor Debroy won't answer it. You have Mr. Chidambaram claiming that it's a patient who's been stopped just before the ICU and is being handled by incompetent doctors. How do you see it?
As I said, I'm not very up to date, and fortunately I'm in Hyderabad. Yes.
No, actually being in Hyderabad gives you a huge advantage.
Yes.
Because you have a better view than those sitting in Delhi.
No, not a better view, more objective view.
More objective view, exactly.
And there is also another.
So what's your objective view?
There is another reason why I'm a little more objective than some, because I spent only 8 years in Delhi. I worked most of my career in Hyderabad.
That's right.
So from a common sense point of view, if I may say so, in the Indian economy, the growth is a little less, or is it little or how more, less than what it was before. So you may call it slowdown, no slowdown, but numbers are less than what they were before. I think that's one, that we accept. Second, I think financial sector, there is a problem, I think, which has not yet been overcome. Something is being done. On the fiscal side, I think even the Comptroller and Auditor General, some issues have come up. And then there is also the issue of employment, which is coming up with the figures. So I think there is enough independent, not magnitudinally precise, but the things are not that comfortable. So it's not only, so therefore, I think there must be something structurally wrong, or rather structurally something should be righted. So, and I think there one thing I want to add, it's not as though the government, from what I understand, the government is not denying the need for reform. The government is doing the reform in the way it thinks it is right. That's a matter which we can debate. So what I want to say is that we should now broadly say that we are in difficulties. I think we should accept that. How difficulty? Some reform is being done. We should all work together to make sure that things improve. So we have to concentrate a little more on what is to be done, what's being done, what's right, what is wrong. Then, I think there is broad admission. I don't think anybody denies. Bibek, will you deny that there is a slowdown compared to the past?
Of course there's a slowdown. That slowdown to something that happened in 2019, that is debatable. Now, so far as the question of reforms is concerned, it depends on the definition of reform. But I will link it to a question that Rajdeep asked you, didn't ask me, so let me volunteer to answer that question. I think this proposition that you require a crisis to reform is somewhat questionable, and let me explain why I mean by that. The sole evidence for that I can see is what happened in 91. Now in 91 also, it is not that there wasn't an alternative. It would not have been a very desirable alternative, and Montek himself mentions a paper which certain left-wing economists had put out, probably reaction to them, document 91, I think. I think the more pertinent question to ask is, there are reforms which pertain only to the external sector. And there are reforms which pertain to the domestic economy, several of which under the 7th schedule are state subjects or in the concurrent list. Montek will remember that in 93, the Department of Economic Affairs brought out a paper called 2 Years After the Reform and the Way Ahead. If you sat down with that paper 2 years after the reform and the way ahead, you would find that many of the items listed in that paper as second generation reforms continue to be on the agenda for reforms today as 5th generation reforms. The reason for that is what I just said. The political economy of domestic reforms is much, much more difficult. It concerns the states. We are talking about factor markets, most of which are state subjects. It is not as simple as devaluing the currency in a situation of an administered exchange rate or reforming purely trade policy. Because if you look at 91, except for industrial delicensing, it was essentially trade policies, which are always similar.
You know, in a sense, picking up from that, and you mentioned this in the book, that this journey of reform has often been done through stealth. You use the word gradualism. You know, some would call it incrementalism, but it's been done often through stealth, or it's been done in a crisis. And then we've seen, whether it's FDI and insurance, or indeed yet another attempt to sell off Air India, that it takes years, it takes decades before you actually get to the point where you've achieved an element of reform. So, I mean, given the complex nature of our political economy, given the fact that states are much more assertive, given the fact that we have so many more political parties today, is it more difficult, you think, today to achieve reform, or easier?
Well, I think the reforms that we now have to do are deeper and more complex, okay? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them.
Give me examples.
Well, okay. Let's take, for example, how do you fix the problem of the banks? Globally, most people think that when you have a problem with public sector banks, you need to reduce the role of the government. I happen to believe that that is so. Many years ago, I think it was Bimmel who said we ought to bring the government share in public sector banks below 33% or something. And the then finance minister, Yashwant Sinha, said, yes, we must do that. But that very government wasn't able to get it done, because within the party, politically, it was not easy. So I think you can't just expect to do it by stealth. You have to take the issue head on. You know, more recently, P.J. Nayak, and I mentioned that in the book, P.J. Nayak had suggested that, okay, if for some reason there's a political problem and you don't want to go below 51%, the important thing is to get the finance ministry out of the functioning of the banks, set up some kind of a holding company, put the government share. You'll need some legislative amendments, but that's easy to do. Put the government shareholding in the holding company. Make sure that the holding company is run by a true professional and not by bureaucrats. And then let that holding company appoint the chief executives of the banks, not have it as a political appointment. Now, you know, it's not the same thing as reducing the share of government below 51%, but it's a substantially different approach. We need to see whether something like that would work. We also need to, and this has been brought up many times, the Reserve Bank of India, public sector banks are subject to dual regulation. They're subject to regulation by the Finance Ministry and also by the Reserve Bank of India. As a result, neither of them do a good job. Now, my personal view is this should end. We should, in fact, get the Finance Ministry out of the business of exercising supervision over the public sector banks, make whatever legislative changes are needed, and fully empower the Reserve Bank of India to give it the same power vis-a-vis public sector banks which it has vis-a-vis private sector banks. In the case of the private sector, if the RBI feels that the chief executive should be removed, they can remove him. They can't do that for the public sector. As a result, the RBI has a perfect excuse that, look, we can't do anything. So we need to face this. We need to go up politically and say we're going to do it, and just do it. In my book, what I've suggested is, why don't we experiment? Take half the public sector banks and put them in the P.J. Nayak mode, and the other half can carry on the way they are, and 10 years later we'll see which ones do better. This would be a sort of Abhijit Banerjee type of experimental economics, which would be quite useful. Now, I think if you don't do any of this, and all you do is you take 10 unreformed public sector banks and merge them into 4 unreformed public sector banks, you cannot call that banking reform. But that's what's happening at the moment.